I heard him say in front of everyone, "This marriage is a joke." The words landed like a stone thrown through glass, and in that single, bright moment, I felt everything I had built vibrate and begin to crack. I put my mug down so slowly, my fingers still remembered the weight. I looked at him the way you look at a stranger who borrowed your face. I said out loud, steady and quiet, "If it is a joke, then I am leaving the stage." The room filled with that awkward laugh people make when they do not know how to be kind to someone else's hurt. I walked out like someone who had practiced the exit in a mirror 100 times but never imagined it would be real. It started at a house party that was supposed to be small. The living room smelled of stale beer, lemon cleaner, and the synthetic perfume he had liked on me when we first met. There was a poker table in the corner with chips and cigarette ash, the television muttering the end of a game show, and the clink of ice in a glass when he said it. His voice was casual, flat as a coin. I remember the metal taste in my mouth, the way the wooden floor felt under my heels as I moved toward the stairs. I remember his friend Jenna leaning back on the couch, amused, and Marcus, our neighbor, looking away like he had just seen a gust of wind lift the edge of a carpet and revealed the floor beneath. I should have left it at that, the way I had left my shoes on the porch, but 3 things happened in quick succession that made it impossible to close the book. First, my phone buzzed with a message from the friend who laughed the loudest. Second, a drawer that I had never opened while sleepwalking through marriage shifted under my hand and revealed a stack of papers with names I did not recognize. Third, I realized I had been paying for things I had no memory of approving. The small betrayals stacked up and formed a map. The map led to accounts in banks I had never heard of, to transfers made at 2 in the morning, to signatures that looked almost like mine. It was not only a joke. It was a plan. The party scene became a chorus of voices I could replay in the silence that followed. "You did what?" Jenna said, a little too sharp. "He didn't mean it like that," he said, the same man who had said it. "She takes things so personally," someone intoned, as if that explained everything. I stood in the doorway watching these actors arrange themselves, and I felt the strange clarity that comes when something you loved reveals its teeth. I left, and the world outside seemed as familiar as a photograph and as unreliable as a dream. I went home and began to look. That night, I opened a bank statement on the coffee table that had been slipped between magazines. The print was small and the numbers were colder than the light in the room. There were charges in cities I had never visited and a transfer labeled asset management that moved a line of money from an account in my name to an account under a trust I had never consented to. There were emails that had been deleted and calls routed through a pay service. The pattern was clinical. Someone had been planning not just an escape from affection, but an extraction of resources, leaving me with appearances but not power. The next morning, I met Marcus for coffee. I had my hair scraped back and an old sweatshirt on, the kind that makes you feel invisible while you do what needs to be done. He sat down, and the cafe smelled of espresso and warm pastry. The sunlight made the sugar dust on muffins glitter like small promises. He shoved his phone across the table with a gravity that felt like an indictment. "You need to see this," he said. He had screenshots of messages between my husband and a banker, a short, clipped exchange about consolidating mutual accounts under a conservatorship-type arrangement because of trust issues and future stability. It read like a transaction note written in human language. Our conversation at the cafe stretched long enough to become a scene. We talked in short sentences, then longer ones as my thought unwound and rewound like thread. "Why would he do this?" I asked. "Because it works," Marcus said. "Because he figured out who could be convinced and who could be silenced." Jenna's voice on the other side of town was calmer on the phone than it had been in the living room. "We did not think he would go this far," she said. There were whispers, but they sounded like jealousy, not fabrication. Over espresso and nervous laughter, I realized the danger was procedural, the kind that hides in forms and signatures and the feigned authority of bank representatives with polite voices. When I say I decided to fight back, I do not mean some cinematic vow taken in a shower of rising strings. I mean I did small, practical things that began to look like a counter-strategy. I opened a new bank account in a different bank, one that required me to show ID, to sign in person, to answer questions that felt like teeth. I paid cash for a safety deposit box and took things there I had always left in drawers. I found a lawyer named Rachel who would not roll her eyes at the word conservatorship, but instead leaned forward and drew an action plan on a napkin. I hired a private investigator named Luis who had a slow smile and a way of describing other people's patterns as if they were weather he understood. I called my sister Emma and told her everything I could think to tell her in plain sentences. The first big confrontation after the party was an explosion. It happened at a small dinner with people he called colleagues, the night he thought it safe to celebrate a business win. The dining room held the smell of rosemary and burnt caramel, the light was low, and there was a playlist on the stereo that sounded like a memory of our honeymoon. I walked in with documents folded into my coat pocket like an arsenal. I did not plan theatrics, but I did plan to be precise. I sat, and we spoke. He smiled to hide his fear. She laughed to hide her part. The exchange became a courtroom in miniature. "You brought receipts?" he asked, trying to make it sound like a joke. "Yes," I said, and that simple assertion changed the air in the room. Conversation unspooled into a sequence I will replay precisely because the details mattered. "Why are you doing this now?" he asked, the false curiosity of someone hoping confusion could be a shield. "Because you made it not a marriage anymore," I said. "You made it a ledger." Jenna interjected, "Maybe you two should talk privately." Marcus said, "This is not the time for an argument." I said, "This is the time for truth." He tried to laugh. "You are being dramatic." I answered, "I am being documented." He said, "Who gave you those papers?" I said, "People who care and people who noticed." He tried to change the subject. I refused. He stood, his chair scraping. "You are making accusations," he said. "Show me proof." I slid the folder across the table. "Here," I said. "Look." The clink of cutlery became the sound of a jury sorting itself out. After that scene, I had to make choices about safety and strategy. I stayed with Emma for a few nights and slept with the phone on my chest like a talisman. I learned how to change passwords and use two-factor authentication. I found an accountant who took off his glasses and spoke with numbers as if they were a shield. We traced transfers through dates, through names, through small payments that on their own looked like gifts, but together formed a pipeline. There was a taste to those nights, metallic and restless, like the feeling that arrives before a storm. Backstory matters because the present did not come out of nowhere. I had been cautious, not naive. I had been raised to believe in partnership as shared labor and shared wins. My parents grew up with scarcity and built a business from odd jobs and patience. I had watched my mother take a ledger and, with a red pen, teach profit patience. I met Mark in a bookstore where no one else seemed to reach for the same dusty edition of a novel. He had a laugh that made me forget names for the rest of the day. We married in a small ceremony under string lights, both of us promising to be better people for each other. For years, we were those people. We built a small company together that sold household goods online. I handled operations, logistics, and customer service. He handled business development and meetings that stretched into night. We were partners on paper and in practice. He was also meticulous about who he let into his financial world, and sometimes that guardedness looked like care. Slowly, that guardedness calcified into control. He started setting up accounts with me listed but inaccessible, making moves that looked insignificant to him but were a pattern to me. I kept a record, in my head and in a small notebook, of decisions that felt off. I never wanted to admit that the man who held my hand in front of our parents could assemble a plan to overwrite my autonomy. But patterns cannot be unlearned once seen. The scene where I met Lewis, the private investigator, was one of those moments when the smell of an office says so much. His workspace smelled of paper, lemon oil, and coffee that had gone cold. He wore a scarf in June and had a way of clearing his throat before he spoke the truth. "You want names and you want dates," he said. "You want to know where the money went and who helped it go. That is a job I know how to do." We drew up a scope. He would look at bank logs, reach out to former employees, follow wires, and see what emails could be retrieved from backups. He told me how long this might take and how long in investigations meant meticulous tedium. If we go fast, he said, we miss things. If we go slow, we find the skeletons in closets. His assistant, Carla, texted updates with a matter-of-factness that felt like a drumbeat. Marcus offered to be a witness. Rachel prepared a letter to our bank demanding records. Jenna confessed that she had once seen an envelope in his study but had assumed it was part of a game. One of the hardest parts of this was naming the allies who would risk social discomfort to stand with me. Rachel, the lawyer, drafted a cease and desist and explained how conservatorship could be weaponized. Some people file for conservatorship not because they think you cannot manage, but because they want control, she said. And then she sketched timelines and emergency motions. Lewis pulled transcripts, slowly weaving a story from the threads he found. Marcus contacted Marcus at the bank, who had worked there for a long time and knew how to pull older records. Emma printed everything and labeled it with Post-its in a handwriting she called neat with a smirk. Dr. Patel, a physician who became my witness for mental health evaluations when the other side started suggesting instability, wrote notes that were factual, careful, and clinically dry. Each person had a role, and each role mattered. The investigation produced a folder that became a physical talisman. It smelled of toner and paper and stress. Inside were bank records, emails, screenshots of messages where phrases like "consolidate under trust" took on a sinister new meaning, and scanned forms that bore my name with a signature that did not match mine exactly, but close enough for someone who thought I would not notice. There were also recordings. One was a voicemail saved by Marcus, a clipped message in a man's voice talking about transferring assets for safekeeping with a laugh at the end. Another was a call between my husband and an unknown banker discussing timelines and protective measures if unexpected public events occurred. There were receipts from an attorney who had consulted about guardianship laws. The documents were a geography of intent. They proved a direction. I remember a specific moment of tension when I sat on the floor of my old kitchen and laid every paper around me like a map. The air had the faint smell of lemon cleaner. The documents made the room feel silent and full at once. I felt tiny and enormous. I thought about the marriage vows and how promises could be turned into instruments. I lay my head back against the cabinet and let the light from the window cut across the papers. For a long time, I simply breathed and cataloged. When we started to assemble evidence for the bank and for court, Rachel insisted on precision. We must show chain of custody, she said. We must demonstrate transfers with dates, signatures, and corroborating testimony. The legal explanation she gave me was practical and short. To contest transfers, we needed to show unauthorized action or fraud, a discrepancy between signatures or authority, and a pattern of behavior. Documentation required certified letters and bank subpoenas that could take between 2 and 6 weeks to process, depending on compliance. Pericia or forensic accounting would require an independent examiner to trace wires and provide a report in 15 to 30 days. Rachel's words were a sobering checklist. There were moments of acute fear. One evening, a formal notice arrived addressed to me stating that a conservatorship petition had been prepared and suggested as an option because of concerns about decision-making. The paper smelled like bureaucracy and intent. It was the most naked attempt to take control disguised as concern. The idea that someone could petition a court to appoint a conservator and thereby control finances and personal decisions felt like an argument made into law. I called Rachel and she explained the technicalities. A conservatorship petition is a legal filing asserting that an individual is unable to manage personal affairs. It triggers a hearing where evidence is reviewed. The person filing must provide medical or financial records and show cause. If an emergency conservatorship is sought, a temporary order might be granted for a short period, often 30 days, while a full hearing is conducted. Scheduled. In our case, the threat was not that the system would protect me, but that it would be used as a tool to freeze access and reputation while decisions were made in a room without me. One of the forced slowdowns in the narrative was sitting with the knowledge that accusations could be flipped back onto me. People had to see the documents and hear witnesses, and they had to see the pattern. We recorded depositions, gathered email trails and text messages, and asked Lewis to locate people who had overheard conversations or seen our husbands sign odd documents. Carla found a former administrative assistant named Hannah who remembered him asking about securing assets in case of an inconvenient separation. Hannah's voice was direct and trembling when she agreed to testify. Each witness added color to a picture that would have looked like paranoia if it lacked corroboration. The courtroom was the hardest, brightest, and most public place any private story can go. I rehearsed testimony in the mirror like a play, but nothing rehearsed the feeling of walking in and having the room hold its breath. The smell of varnished wood and coffee and the rustle of paper met me. The judge entered, an ordinary person with a robe and the power to rearrange lives. The room contained the man who had called our marriage a joke and the colleagues who had once laughed at his jokes. He sat a little straighter than usual, the way people do when they think their script will hold. We had technical evidence and witnesses and a narrative. We also had a recorded voicemail where he said, in a voice that meant to be casual, "If it comes down to it, we can always move the funds under a trust and call the rest an arrangement." We had bank statements that showed transfers in odd increments at times when I was asleep or traveling. We had an expert from the bank who explained in court, plainly and in legal language, how a transfer could be initiated by one signatory if the other was misled or if authority was misrepresented. That expert also explained that banks are required to follow Know Your Customer protocols, but that sometimes forms are completed with missing attestations that later are difficult to trace. She outlined steps banks use to verify account changes and typical timeframes for hold requests. Her testimony tied the papers to processes. The tension in the courtroom had its own rhythm. There were moments when the air seemed to lean in to see what would happen. The opposing counsel tried to make me look frantic, to suggest that I was overreacting to a few emails. I answered in slow sentences. Rachel objected when irrelevant lines were introduced. The judge admonished the other counsel for leading. At one point, my sister Emma gave a statement about behavior she had witnessed. Marcus explained why he had saved voicemails and why he had given us bank call logs. Hannah's testimony about overheard phrases from years prior felt small and crucial. Luis explained the methodology of his findings in technical terms and then translated them into plain speech for the jury of the court, which in family matters can sometimes mean the judge and a clerk. There were a few pings of triumph when a piece of paper landed on the table and the room changed. I watched as expressions shifted from dismissal to attention. The line between private grievance and public proof is a narrow bridge built by documentation. When the opposing counsel tried to bring up my past mistakes, Rachel reminded the court of relevance and boundaries. When a surprise document surfaced, the judge allowed it and my throat tightened. The moment when several documents all connected at a precise point felt like watching a constellation light up. One tension moment that I will always remember was the silence that followed the playing of a recording. A small device on the table crackled, and then a voice, familiar and casual, said, "We should secure everything before she notices. It will be easier that way." The room inhaled together. People looked at each other and then at him. He tried to smirk. He tried to say, "That was taken out of context." Context carries weight. The recording had been authenticated by Luis and accepted by the court. For a long minute, nothing else mattered but the sound of that voice and the implication it carried. The judge took time with his decision. There were hearings about temporary restraining orders and an emergency motion to prevent transfer of assets while the case was pending. The legal explanation from Rachel in court was concise. To prevent asset dissipation during litigation, lawyers can request a temporary restraining order or an asset preservation order. The court can freeze accounts for the duration necessary to prevent irreparable harm, typically through an interim order, often lasting until a full hearing or for a set period, like 30 days, extendable on cause. Such mechanisms are procedural safeguards but require precise affidavits and proof of imminent risk. We prepared those affidavits with care. When the judge issued an order to freeze certain accounts and to require both parties to provide a full ledger, I felt a cautious release. It was not victory, it was containment. It meant that the transfers could not continue while the court reviewed evidence. It meant that a conservatorship petition could not be weaponized in the short term to strip me of access. It also opened the door for discovery. Discovery meant more paperwork, but also transparency. We subpoenaed records. The bank complied slowly, producing stacks of documents that smelt like the bureaucratic past. In discovery, we found more threads: small cash withdrawals after late-night calls, wire transfers to shell entities, payments to a law office registered under a different name but with a similar address to one I knew. When the largest witness took the stand, the atmosphere changed. Hannah testified about the envelope and described a handwriting study that suggested signatures had been traced over to produce plausible lines. The handwriting expert explained, in clear, non-technical language, how certain strokes indicated an overlay rather than an original signature. The testimony was technical but also human. The court listened to the chain of custody of each document and the way each signature had been handled. That technical testimony was short and sharp, roughly 3 minutes, but it translated the papers into a coherent narrative of intent. There were setbacks too. The other side produced a set of emails where I had been curt, where our partnership looked rocky before the party. They argued that our marital strife was the context for my claims. Rachel countered that marital difficulty is not probable cause to transfer funds without consent. She reminded the court of fiduciary duties and the standards banks must meet when executing transfers. The judge asked for careful accounting, and a forensic accountant was appointed to produce a report within a prescribed time. The forensic accounting process was explained in court as follows. An examiner reconstructs financial flows by tracing deposits and disbursements, identifying unusual patterns, and comparing signatures and authorizations. They produce a report that can take several weeks and includes a methodology section, an itemized list of transactions, and conclusions about irregularities and potential fraud. This process is exhaustive and technical, but it was the language the court respected. 3 moments of acute tension slowed time into a different shape for me. The first was when I found a phantom email account with archived attachments that included a draft trust document bearing my name. I sat at my kitchen table, and the only noise was the hum of the refrigerator and the wet whisper of a night rain. I remember thinking in small, precise images. The second was the day of the hearing for the emergency order, when the judge read parts of a transcript aloud, and I heard phrases that made me dizzy. The third was the moment the judge asked my husband to stand and answer questions under oath. Watching his face while he spoke under oath was like watching a mural crack. Each of these moments became a paragraph I would return to in therapy and in late-night conversations, sometimes with rage and often with a brittle, astonished humor. After months of depositions, subpoena, and hearings, the narrative started to tilt. The bank agreed to reverse certain transfers pending the forensic accounting report. The judge issued a protection order preventing unilateral changes to our shared assets. The conservatorship motion faltered when the court saw the pattern of organized transfers and the motive presented in the evidence. In legal terms, the judge found insufficient cause to appoint a conservator when accusations seemed more aimed at asset control than genuine incapacity. There was no dramatic scene of shackles or bands, only the slow unwinding of a structure that had relied on surprise and misdirection. The epilogue after the court proceedings is best told in time slices, because healing and restitution do not happen all at once. At 1 month, things were raw and practical. The frozen accounts were still frozen, but we had access to emergency funds through an arrangement the bank put in place after legal insistence. I met with an advisor to rebuild my financial plan and learn to read statements with new literacy. I began to attend a support group for people who had experienced financial abuse. The days felt long but purposeful. The people who helped were visible. Rachel sent a concise email outlining next steps. Marcus visited with coffee and sat with me in silence for an hour. Luis provided a written timeline of investigative steps that would be part of the record. Dr. Patel suggested coping strategies for the anxiety that came in waves. 1 month in, I slept better, though not easily. I started to name the experience out loud in a way that was no longer just fury. At 3 months, the forensic accounting report arrived, and it was thorough and methodical. The report itemized transfers, showed the odd timing of transactions, and explained which accounts had been used as conduits. It linked payments to shell entities and provided an expert opinion that certain transfers were inconsistent with normal business practice. Following the report, the bank offered a settlement to resolve the disputed transfers and to pay restitution for fees and unauthorized withdrawals. We negotiated and accepted terms that returned some assets and required the accused to make financial reparations. Publicly, the court recorded a reprimand for the misuse of legal process when the conservatorship was shown to be used of leverage. The city paper ran a factual piece naming players without sensationalism. My network expanded into an unexpected community of people who left comments online with acronyms and prayers and offers of help. At 3 months, I started volunteering with a nonprofit that helps people document financial abuse. I wanted to turn the method I had learned into a tool for others. At 6 months, life had altered and settled into a shape that was not a return to the old, but a construction of the new. I had returned to work full-time and taken on a leadership role in a community initiative aimed at financial literacy and abuse prevention. The reparations agreed upon in settlement allowed me to pay down debt and to invest modestly in a new direction. My reputation had been defended in part by witnesses who testified, by documents that had been authenticated, and by the painstaking work of people who had chosen to tell the truth. The man who had called our marriage a joke was required by court order to provide a public statement acknowledging the dispute and agreeing to a set of conditions about financial conduct, including regular audits and restrictions on unilateral transfers. He lost professional contacts who had been complicit and faced sanctions from a regulator. Trade association. I started teaching workshops on recognizing financial red flags and began a support group that met monthly at the library. The aftermath also brought me other gifts. I rediscovered friendships that had been quiet for years but were durable. Emma and I cooked together and laughed in a way that felt like a small revolution. Marcus became a close friend and occasional co-conspirator in small acts of mischief that felt healing. Rachel joined a panel I put together about legal remedies against financial abuse. Lewis wrote a short op-ed about the mechanics of concealment and why investigators matter. Hannah, who had been nervous about speaking up, began to work at a nonprofit aimed at protecting whistleblowers. Dr. Patel continued to meet with me and helped me see patterns in behavior and in my own responses. Carla became the person who sent updates that felt like a lifeline. I named these allies often because the case was not a solitary victory. It was a communal correction. If you are watching this and wondering what you should do if you suspect something similar, here are practical steps that helped me. Keep records of every strange charge and email. Use a separate account for savings and do not share passwords. Consult a lawyer early, even if it is just to get a sense of options. Find a private investigator if you suspect the trail leads to complex transfers. Ask for bank statements in certified form and request a formal audit if you see unexplained activity. Remember that protective orders and asset freezes are tools that can buy you the time needed for a full review. Most of all, name who your allies are and ask them to keep records and to be ready to testify. This story ends with a sense of reclaimed dignity. He said our marriage was a joke, and I let that statement sit for a moment before I replied. Sometimes the best retort is evidence. The last legal document I signed was not a declaration of war, but a settlement and a statement of restored agency. I am not naive about the future. People can be inventive and ruthless, but I am also no longer quiet about what happened. I teach, I write, and I volunteer. I have a small group of people who check in and who know how to read a bank statement. If this video helped you feel less alone or gave you one practical step to protect yourself, comment below with the words "I lived" or "I support" to let others know you are here. Subscribe if you want more detailed guides about conservatorships, forensic accounting, and legal strategies against financial abuse. If you are in immediate danger, contact local authorities and seek legal counsel. And remember this, someone may call your life a joke, but the person who writes the last page is often the one who kept the receipts.